Henry Remington stood in the suffocating heat of his dying field, clutching a bank foreclosure notice that spelled the end of his family's century-old legacy. He was $1 million in debt, cornered by a predatory corporate rival, and entirely out of time. But what Henry didn't know was that his exhausted farmhand's catastrophic mistake, spilling a forgotten, discontinued chemical compound into the main irrigation tank, was about to trigger an impossible biological anomaly. It wasn't just going to save his farm, it was going to shock the entire agricultural world. The sun over Windermere Valley didn't just shine, it punished. It baked the moisture from the soil until the earth cracked into deep, jagged web lines that looked like shattered glass. Henry Remington knelt in the middle of his 300-acre property, letting a handful of bone-dry topsoil slip through his calloused fingers. The dust blew away in the arid breeze before it even hit the ground. For 4 generations, the Remington farm had been the crown jewel of the county. They had survived the Great Depression, the devastating floods of the 80s, and the shifting economies of modern agriculture. But they were not going to survive this. At 34 years old, Henry looked a decade older. His face was lined with the deep grooves of chronic stress, his knuckles permanently stained with engine grease and soil, and his bank accounts were entirely drained. The drought had been brutal, lasting 3 consecutive seasons. While the massive corporate conglomerates in the neighboring counties could afford million-dollar deep well irrigation systems and government-subsidized bailouts, independent farmers like Henry were left to wither on the vine. "Henry, you're bleeding out," Thomas Mitchell, the branch manager at Windermere First National, had told him just 2 days prior. Thomas was a decent man, an old friend of Henry's late father, but the heavy oak desk between them felt like an insurmountable wall. "I just need one more extension, Tom," Henry had pleaded, his voice tight. "The forecasts are predicting a shift in the weather patterns. If I can just get the seed in the ground for the winter yield." "It's out of my hands," Thomas interrupted gently, removing his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "The board reviewed your file this morning. You've missed 3 consecutive mortgage payments on the main acreage. Your equipment loans are in default. If you don't have $250,000 by the end of the month, the bank is going to foreclose. I'm sorry, Artie, I really am." The drive back to the farm that day had been a blur of suppressed panic, but the true gut punch hadn't come from the bank. It had come waiting for him at his own front gate. Parked blocking the entrance to the Remington driveway was a sleek, black SUV. Leaning against the hood in an immaculately tailored suit that looked absurd against the backdrop of dying cornstalks was Harrison Goyle. Goyle was the CEO of Apex AgriCorp, a sprawling, ruthless agricultural empire that had been systematically buying up distressed family farms across the state, bulldozing the old homesteads and turning them into soulless, automated megafarms. Goyle had wanted the Remington land for 5 years, its central location over a major aquifer, which Henry couldn't afford to tap, made it the missing puzzle piece in Goyle's regional monopoly. "Afternoon, Henry," Goyle said, a smug, predatory smile stretching across his face. He didn't offer his hand. "Looks like you could use some rain, or a miracle." "Move your truck, Harrison," Henry growled, gripping the steering wheel of his rusted pickup so tightly his knuckles turned white. "I hear the bank is pulling the plug," Goyle continued, entirely unbothered, pulling a folded document from his inside breast pocket. "I can make this easy for you. I'll buy the deed today. 40 cents on the dollar. It's enough to pay off your debts, keep you out of bankruptcy court, and leave you with just enough cash to move to the city and find a nice, safe desk job." Henry stepped out of his truck, his towering frame casting a shadow over the shorter corporate executive. "This land is not for sale. Not to you, not to anyone. It's my family's legacy." Goyle chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Pride is an expensive luxury, Henry. You're holding onto a corpse. In 30 days the bank takes it, and I'll just buy it from them at auction for even less. Take the deal. Spare your wife the humiliation of being dragged out of her home by the sheriff." The mention of his wife sent a spike of blinding rage through Henry. He stepped forward, his chest inches from Goyle's. "If you ever bring Cleo into this again, I won't just run you off my land. I'll put you under it. Get off my property." Goyle's smile vanished. His eyes turned cold and hard. "You're a fool, Remington. Enjoy the dirt." Now, standing alone in the dying field, Henry felt the weight of that encounter pressing down on his chest. Goyle was right about one thing. Cleo didn't deserve this. Cleo was an accountant who had given up a lucrative firm job in Chicago to marry him and live the quiet farm life. She had spent the last 3 years massaging their dwindling numbers, robbing Peter to pay Paul, skipping meals, and hiding the true extent of her anxiety to keep his spirits up. Henry walked back to the farmhouse as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in mocking shades of brilliant gold and crimson. He made a silent vow right there in the dust. He was not going to lose this farm. He was going to make one final, desperate gamble. If he was going down, he was going down swinging. The farmhouse kitchen was silent, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. It was 2 a.m. Henry sat at the worn oak table, surrounded by stacks of unpaid invoices, tax documents, and agricultural seed catalogs. A single overhead bulb cast harsh shadows across his exhausted face. Cleo appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a thick wool cardigan, holding 2 mugs of black coffee. "You haven't slept in 3 days, Artie," she said softly, setting a mug in front of him and pulling up a chair. Her eyes, usually bright and full of life, were shadowed with dark circles. "I can't sleep. If I close my eyes, I just see Goyle's face," Henry muttered, taking a sip of the bitter coffee. "Cleo, I have a plan. But you're going to think I've lost my mind." Cleo managed a weak, exhausted smile. "At this point, I'd welcome a little insanity if it pays the mortgage. What are you thinking?" Henry pulled out a glossy, high-end seed catalog he had ordered from an elite agricultural research firm in Europe. He flipped to a page, dog-eared and circled in red ink. "The Celeria strain," Henry said, tapping the page. "It's a genetically optimized, rapid-growth hybrid soybean. They engineered it for high-altitude, arid climates. It requires half the water of standard crops, matures in exactly 28 days, and the protein yield is so dense that pharmaceutical and organic food companies are paying triple the market rate for it." Cleo pulled the catalog closer, her accountant's brain instantly processing the numbers. "Henry, the cost of these seeds, it's astronomical. It says here a single pallet is $20,000. We need at least 4 pallets to plant enough acreage to make the $250,000 we need for the bank." $80,000, Henry confirmed, his voice barely a whisper. "We have exactly $2,000 in our checking account," Cleo said gently, not wanting to crush him, but needing to ground him in reality. "We are maxed out on every credit card. We don't have $80,000. Henry took a deep breath. "I sold the vintage John Deere." Cleo gasped. The 1950 John Deere tractor was Henry's most prized possession. He and his late father had spent 5 years restoring it piece by piece. It was a museum-quality heirloom. "And," Henry continued, his voice cracking slightly, "I took out a title loan on the house. The remaining equity, a private lender in the city, high interest, very high." Cleo stared at him in stunned silence. "Henry, a private lender? A loan shark? If this crop fails, we don't just lose the farm, we lose everything. We'll be on the street with absolutely nothing. If we do nothing, we lose it all anyway in 30 days, Henry pleaded, reaching across the table to take her hands. "This is it, Cleo, the ultimate Hail Mary. The seeds arrive tomorrow. We prep the soil, we plant, and in 28 days, we harvest a crop worth $300,000. We pay off the bank, we pay off the lender, and we tell Harrison Goyle to go straight to hell." Cleo looked into her husband's desperate, pleading eyes. She saw the terrified little boy inside the hardened farmer, terrified of being the one to break the family chain. She squeezed his hands. Okay, Artie. We go all in." The next morning, the farm was a hive of frantic, nervous energy. A freight delivery truck dropped off 4 massive pallets of the Celeria seeds. They came in heavy, moisture-sealed bags, looking less like agriculture and more like highly classified technology. Assisting Henry was Benji Cobb. Benji was a 62-year-old farmhand who had worked on the Remington property since Henry was in diapers. Benji was fiercely loyal, possessing a heart of gold, but his age and a bad hip made him a bit slower these days, and his eyesight was rapidly failing him, a fact he stubbornly refused to admit to Henry, refusing to wear his thick prescription glasses out of pure, stubborn pride. "All right, Benji, listen to me very carefully," Henry said, shouting over the roar of the tractor engine as they hooked up the liquid fertilizer tank. "These seeds are incredibly temperamental. The manual says they need a very specific pre-treatment before they go into the soil. We need to mix the standard nitrogen base with the biological activator they sent in the red drums." Benji nodded, wiping sweat from his brow with a greasy rag. "Red drums. Nitrogen base. Got it, boss. Don't you worry about a thing. You go calibrate the seeder. I'll get the chemical mix sorted in the main tank." "It has to be exact, Benji," Henry stressed, his heart pounding with anxiety. "If the pH balance is off, it will scorch the seed casing. We only have one shot at this." "I've been mixing fertilizer since before you learned how to ride a bicycle, Henry." Benji chuckled warmly. "Go on. I'll meet you out at the south field." Henry patted the older man on the shoulder, feeling a brief, fleeting moment of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this insane plan was going to work. He climbed into the cab of the modern tractor and drove out to the south field to prepare the drill lines. Back at the storage shed, the dim lighting and the oppressive heat were playing tricks on Benji's aging eyes. He squinted at the row of drums lined up against the corrugated tin wall. He found the nitrogen base easily enough and pumped the required hundreds of gallons into the mixing tank. Now he needed the biological activator. Henry had said the red drums. Benji walked down the line. In the corner of the shed, covered in a thick layer of dust and spider webs, sat a rusted, dented drum. Its original color was heavily faded, but in the shadows to Benji's unglassed eyes, it looked like a dull brick red. What Benji couldn't read was the faded, peeling label on the back. It didn't belong to the new Solaria seeds. It was a drum of Promethium Zinc Compound 404, an experimental, highly caustic soil fumigant from 1989 that Henry's grandfather had bought and ultimately abandoned because it was discovered to aggressively mutate and burn the cellular walls of broadleaf crops. It was effectively a highly concentrated, obsolete poison designed to eradicate deep-rooted invasive weeds by accelerating their cellular growth until they collapsed. Ignorant to the disaster he was holding, Benji dragged the heavy rusted drum to the intake valve. He unscrewed the cap, ignoring the pungent metallic odor that wafted into the air, and dumped the entire contents into the main irrigation mixing tank. The machine whirred to life, blending the ancient volatile chemical with the modern nitrogen base. The planting took 18 exhausting, back-breaking hours. Henry and Benji worked through the blistering afternoon, into the twilight, and finally, under the harsh glare of the tractor's floodlights. The mechanical seeder hummed a rhythmic, hypnotic tune, dropping the expensive Solaria seeds into the dry earth, immediately followed by a high-pressure spray of Benji's chemical concoction to seal them in. By the time they finished, it was 4 a.m. Henry climbed down from the tractor, his muscles screaming in agony, but a profound sense of relief washed over him. The seed was in the ground. The gamble was officially in play. "Good work, Benji," Henry rasped, tossing the older man a bottle of warm water. "Now we pray for that weather front to push in a little humidity, and we wait." Benji tipped his hat, looking equally exhausted. "They're gonna sprout beautifully, Henry. I can feel it in my bones. I'll go clean up the shed and lock down the tanks." "No, leave it for the morning," Henry said, waving a hand. "Go home. Get some sleep." Henry walked back to the house, stripped off his dirt-caked clothes on the porch, and fell into bed beside a sleeping Cleo. For the first time in months, he slept soundly, dreaming of rolling green fields and a zero balance on his bank statements. The nightmare began precisely at 9 a.m. the next morning. Henry woke up, poured a cup of coffee, and walked out to the storage shed to inventory the empty seed bags and log the chemical usage for his financial records. He stepped into the dim shed, humming a quiet tune. He walked over to the corner where the new shipment of red drums sat. He froze. His blood turned to ice in his veins. There were 4 bright red drums of the biological activator sitting on the pallet. They were sealed. Untouched. Henry's coffee mug slipped from his hand, shattering on the concrete floor. The hot liquid splashed against his boots, but he didn't feel it. His eyes darted around the shed in wild, mounting panic. If these are full, what did Benji put in the tank? Henry frantically scanned the room. Then he saw it. Near the intake valve, laying on its side, was the rusted, faded barrel of Promethium Zinc Compound 404. The cap was off. The interior was completely empty. A sound escaped Henry's throat, a horrific, strangled gasp of pure devastation. He stumbled forward, dropping to his knees beside the empty barrel, his trembling hands tracing the faded skull and crossbones warning label that had been obscured by decades of grime. Warning: caustic agent induces rapid cellular necrosis in legumes and hybrid crops. Do not use within 500 yards of active plantings. Benji had just sprayed highly concentrated, hyper-accelerated poison directly onto $80,000 worth of the most fragile, genetically temperamental seeds on the market. No! 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 Henry chanted, scrambling to his feet. He sprinted out of the shed, running like a madman toward the south field. He reached the edge of the freshly turned earth and fell to his knees in the dirt. He dug frantically with his bare hands, tearing up the neat rows until he found one of the Celeria's seeds. He held it up to the morning light. It was already ruined. The normally smooth, pale green casing of the seed had turned a sickly, bruised purple. It was swollen, bloated to twice its normal size, emitting a faint, acrid smell of burnt plastic. The chemical reaction was already tearing the seed apart from the inside. Henry collapsed entirely, laying flat on his back in the dust, staring up at the unforgiving, cloudless sky. It was over. The $80,000 was gone. The private lender would take the house. The bank would take the land. Harrison Goyle had won. It was a total, unmitigated disaster. When Cleo found him 2 hours later, he hadn't moved. She saw the empty rusted barrel in the shed, on her way out to the field, and when she saw the look of hollow, deadened grief in her husband's eyes, she knew exactly what had happened. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just sat down in the dirt next to him, pulled his head into her lap, and let him weep. For 3 days, Henry refused to leave the house. He ignored calls from the bank. He ignored a smug voicemail from Harrison Goyle. He couldn't even bring himself to fire Benji, who had broken down in inconsolable tears when he realized what his poor eyesight had caused. Henry just sat in the dark living room, waiting for the inevitable knock of the sheriff coming to serve the foreclosure papers. Out in the south field, under the blistering sun, the poisoned seeds cooked in the earth. By all known laws of botany, chemistry, and agriculture, they were dead. They should have dissolved into toxic mush. But deep beneath the topsoil, hidden in the suffocating darkness, an impossible reaction was occurring. The advanced, genetically engineered DNA of the Celeria soybean, designed to survive harsh extremes, was colliding violently with the aggressive, mutation-inducing synthetic enzymes of the 1989 poison. The seed didn't die, it fought back. On the morning of the 4th day, Henry finally stepped out onto the front porch to retrieve the mail, looking like a ghost haunting his own property. He glanced listlessly toward the south field. He stopped. He blinked, rubbing his bloodshot eyes, certain his fractured mind was finally hallucinating. He dropped the mail across the entirety of the 300-acre south field, breaking through the dry, cracked earth with violent, terrifying speed, was a sea of vivid, neon crimson sprouts. They were growing so fast that Henry could almost hear the soil tearing apart. Henry's boots pounded against the dry earth, kicking up clouds of dust as he sprinted toward the south field. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a mixture of terror and awe flooding his system. He reached the edge of the property line and dropped to his knees, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch the impossible. The celeriac sprouts were not green. They were a vivid, pulsating shade of neon crimson, looking more like alien flora than anything that belonged in the Windermere Valley. And they were growing. Not just germinating, they were actively, aggressively pushing out of the soil at a rate that defied every known law of biology. Usually, a soybean sprout would take a week just to show a fragile, pale green hook above the topsoil. These were already 3 inches tall, their stalks thick, rigid, and covered in a fine silver fuzz that seemed to trap the morning dew. Cleo ran up behind him, her breath hitching as she took in the sight of the 300-acre field bathed in red. "Henry, what is this? What's happening?" "I don't know," Henry whispered, his fingers gently tracing the edge of a crimson leaf. It didn't feel soft or delicate like a normal seedling. It felt like heavy-duty canvas, incredibly tough and resilient. "They didn't die, Cleo. The chemical compound, it didn't kill them." Benji's rusted pickup truck rattled down the driveway a few minutes later. The old farmhand stepped out, his face pale, expecting to be fired on the spot. Instead, he found his employers staring out at a sea of impossible red vegetation. Benji pulled off his cap, squinting hard. "Lord Almighty, Henry, did I plant the wrong seeds entirely?" "No, Benji," Henry said, slowly standing up, a dangerous, wild spark of hope igniting in his chest. "You planted exactly what we ordered. But that Promethium Zinc 404, it did something. We need a professional. We need Caldwell." Dr. Aris Caldwell was an independent agricultural geneticist based out of the State University, a man who possessed a brilliant mind, but had been largely blacklisted by corporate giants like Apex AgriCorp for his refusal to sign non-disclosure agreements regarding pesticide runoffs. He was a purist, a man who loved the science of the soil more than the politics of the industry. When Caldwell arrived at the farm 3 hours later in his mobile laboratory van, he stepped out, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, and stopped dead in his tracks. "Henry," Caldwell breathed, walking into the field like a man stepping onto hallowed ground. This is biologically staggering." Caldwell spent the next 4 hours entirely consumed by his work. He took soil samples, snipped stalks, measured root depth, and ran chemical analyses through the humming machines in the back of his van. Henry, Cleo, and Benji sat on the porch, waiting in agonizing silence, watching the sun beat down on the red field. Normally, seedlings exposed to this kind of aggressive afternoon heat without irrigation would wilt and collapse. The crimson sprouts didn't just survive, they seemed to thrive, turning a deeper, darker shade of red as they absorbed the solar radiation. Finally, Caldwell emerged from his van, holding a clipboard, his face an unreadable mask of intense concentration. He walked up the porch steps and sat down heavily in a wicker chair. "I have run the genetic sequencing 3 times because I refused to believe the first 2 results," Caldwell began, looking directly at Henry. "The celeriac seed was engineered to be highly defensive against drought. But when Benji introduced the Promethium Zinc 404, it acted as an extreme, apocalyptic stressor. The caustic agent began to dissolve the cellular walls, just as it was designed to do." "So why didn't they die?" Cleo asked, leaning forward, her hands tightly clasped. "Because of a localized genetic panic response," Caldwell explained, tapping his pen against the clipboard. "The advanced DNA of the celeriac recognized the impending cellular death, and it forcefully recoded its own survival mechanisms. It rapidly absorbed the zinc from the poison, using it to fortify its cellular walls with a metallic-like resilience, while hyper-accelerating its photosynthesis to outpace the necrosis. The red pigmentation is a result of anthocyanin overproduction. It's essentially acting as a permanent, high-grade sunscreen." Henry stared at him, trying to process the science. Dr. Caldwell, give it to me straight. Are they going to survive? Will they yield? Caldwell let out a breathless, disbelieving laugh. Survive? Henry, they are dominating. The root systems are already 3 feet deep, cracking through the hardpan to access residual moisture that standard crops could never reach. They are growing at roughly 300% the normal rate. If this trajectory holds, you won't be harvesting in 28 days. When? Henry asked, his pulse pounding in his ears. 14, Caldwell said softly. You will have a fully mature harvest in exactly 2 weeks, but... The geneticist's face darkened, bringing the soaring hope crashing back down to earth. We have a massive problem. The plants survived the poison, yes. But I won't know until they fruit whether the soybeans themselves are toxic. If the zinc promethium compound passed into the actual reproductive yield, the beans will be highly poisonous. You'll have a 1,000,000-pound harvest of toxic waste. The words hung in the oppressive afternoon heat. The gamble was still alive, but the stakes had just been raised to astronomical heights. We let them grow, Henry declared, his voice hard, his eyes fixed on the crimson field. We have 2 weeks before the bank takes the deed. We let them grow, we test the fruit, and we pray. Word travels fast in Windermere Valley, especially when it involves the town's oldest farm, turning the color of fresh blood. Within 3 days, rumors were spreading like wildfire at the local diner, the feed store, and the tractor supply depot. And naturally, those rumors reached the pristine, air-conditioned top-floor office of Harrison Goyle. Goyle stood by his floor-to-ceiling window, overlooking the massive automated expanse of Apex AgriCorp's holdings. His desk was completely devoid of clutter, a testament to his sterile, controlled nature. He was holding a tablet displaying high-resolution drone photography. The images showed the Remington farm. The south field was a sprawling, vibrant sea of dark, aggressive red. It was day 8 of the growth cycle, and the stalks were already waist-high, thickly woven together like a jungle canopy. It's a freak mutation, Mr. Goyle, said Dean Harker, a massive, broad-shouldered man with a scarred jawline who served as Apex's head of security. A polite corporate title for a man who specialized in intimidation and off-the-books sabotage. Our agronomists analyzed the drone footage. They say it shouldn't be possible. They're projecting a yield density that would break every record in the state. Goyle threw the tablet onto his desk, his face contorted in a rare display of unmasked fury. I don't care what is possible, Dean. I care that Henry Remington is supposed to be completely bankrupt by the end of next week. If he harvests a record-breaking crop, he pays off his loans, he keeps the land, and we lose the central aquifer access forever. I will not lose a multi-million-dollar regional monopoly because a dirt-poor farmer got lucky with some mutant weeds. Goyle paced the room, his mind working furiously. I went to the bank. I pressured Thomas Mitchell to call the loan in early, citing environmental hazards. I claimed Remington was growing an unapproved, toxic invasive species, but Mitchell stonewalled me, said he needed an official EPA citation to break the grace period. Goyle turned to Dean, his eyes cold and dead. We can't wait for the EPA. If that crop reaches maturity, Henry wins. I want it destroyed. Tonight. Dean smiled, a cruel, predatory expression. I can introduce a localized herbicide into his main irrigation line. Standard defoliant. Undetectable until the plants start withering. By morning, that red field will be a brown graveyard. Do it, Goyle commanded. And if anyone gets in your way, handle it. I am not losing that land. That night, a thick, suffocating humidity settled over the Remington farm. The moon was hidden behind a heavy bank of storm clouds, leaving the property plunged in absolute darkness. Since Dr. Caldwell's visit, Henry hadn't slept for more than 2 hours at a time. The anxiety was a physical weight on his chest. The plants were growing with terrifying speed, developing thick, ruby-red pods by day 9. But the fear of toxicity, combined with a looming foreclosure, had him wound tighter than a coiled spring. At 1 a.m., Henry was sitting on the porch, a loaded 12-gauge shotgun resting across his lap. It wasn't paranoia if they were actually out to get you, he reasoned. He knew Harrison Goyle. Goyle didn't lose gracefully. Down in the shadows near the storage shed, a chain-link fence rattled. Henry sat up, his senses instantly on high alert. The farm dogs, usually loud and protective, were conspicuously silent, a sign someone had thrown them heavily sedated meat. Tosa, Henry slipped off the porch, moving silently through the tall grass, his thumb resting lightly on the safety of the shotgun. Near the main water intake valve, Dean Harker was working quickly. He had a heavy-duty bolt cutter and a 5-gallon jug of industrial-grade chemical defoliant. He snapped the padlock on the pump housing and reached for the main reservoir lid. "Step away from the tank," a voice boomed out of the darkness. Dean whipped around. The beam of a heavy mag light blinded him, but he could clearly see the twin barrels of the shotgun pointed directly at his chest. "Henry Remington," Dean said smoothly, holding his hands up in mock surrender. "Just checking the lines for you. Looks like you've got a bit of a trespasser problem." "I know exactly who you are, Harker," Henry growled, stepping into the dim ambient light, his face a mask of furious resolve. "And I know who sent you. If you pour one drop of that poison into my water supply, they'll be burying you in the south field. Put the jug down." Dean slowly lowered the jug to the ground, but instead of backing away, his hand darted to his waistband, pulling a heavy, suppressed, semi-automatic pistol. Henry's reflexes were fast, but before either man could pull a trigger, the mutated farm itself intervened. Dean took a swift step backward to find cover, completely misjudging his footing near the edge of the red field. The Celeria plants had developed a root system that didn't just go deep, it aggressively breached the surface to absorb night moisture, creating thick, iron-hard vines that lay across the dirt like tripwires. Dean's boot caught violently on a massive red root. He went down hard, his head slamming into the heavy iron pipe of the irrigation valve with a sickening crunch. The pistol clattered harmlessly into the dirt. Henry stood over the unconscious corporate thug, his chest heaving, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He looked down at the thick, crimson root that had literally tripped up his enemy. It was as if the land itself was fighting back. He didn't call the police. Calling the sheriff would mean an investigation, yellow tape, and a quarantine on the field, right when he needed to harvest. Instead, Henry dragged Dean to his unmarked truck, threw him in the passenger seat, drove it to the county line, and left him parked on the shoulder of the highway with a terrifying warning pinned to his shirt. "Tell Goyle the next one doesn't come back." Day 14 arrived with the brilliance of a clear, crisp morning. The heat wave had finally broken, leaving the Windermere Valley bathed in soft golden sunlight. The south field was a staggering, breathtaking sight. The crimson stalks had reached their maximum height of 4 feet, and they were completely bowed over under the sheer, impossible weight of the crop. The soybean pods were massive, the size of a man's thumb, and deep, glistening ruby red. Dr. Eris Caldwell's mobile lab van sped up the driveway before 7 a.m., kicking up a rooster tail of dust. The scientist practically leapt from the vehicle, holding a manila folder, his eyes wide, his hair disheveled. Henry, Cleo, and Benji were waiting by the porch. The silence was agonizing. Everything hinged on the paperwork in Caldwell's hands. The results came back from the mass spectrometer at the university, Caldwell said, struggling to catch his breath. He looked directly at Cleo, then Henry. "Zero toxicity." Cleo let out a choked sob, burying her face in her hands. Benji fell to his knees in the grass, whispering a frantic prayer of thanks to the sky. Henry simply closed his eyes as a single tear escaped, tracing the deep lines of his weathered face. "But that's not all," Caldwell continued, his voice rising in scientific ecstasy. "Henry, the promethium zinc compound didn't just fail to poison the fruit. It altered the protein folding process at a molecular level. Standard soybeans have a protein content of about 36%. These red beans have a protein density of 68%. They are packed with complex amino acids, zinc, and iron. It is quite literally a superfood. A pharmaceutical-grade nutritional marvel." "What does that mean for the market value?" Cleo asked, her accountant's mind immediately kicking into gear, wiping away her tears. "It means," Caldwell said, looking at the field in awe, "that you aren't holding a crop worth $300,000. The organic pharmaceutical buyers in Europe and Silicon Valley biotech firms will pay upwards of $80 a bushel for this. Henry, conservatively, you have over $4 million worth of raw products sitting in that dirt." The number hit Henry like a physical blow. $4 million. It was enough to pay off the bank, pay off the private loan shark, upgrade every piece of equipment on the farm, and set his family up for generations. The desperate gamble hadn't just worked, it had completely rewritten their destiny. "Benji," Henry barked, his voice filled with a commanding electric energy he hadn't possessed in years. "Fire up the combine harvester. We are pulling this crop out of the ground today." The harvest took 48 straight hours. The massive mechanical combine roared through the fields, severing the thick crimson stalks and separating the ruby-red beans into the holding tanks. Because the yield was so impossibly dense, Henry had to rent 3 additional silo trucks just to hold the overflow. By the end of day 16, the field was stripped bare, and the silos were overflowing with the most valuable agricultural product the state had ever seen. The bank deadline was in 5 days. Henry drove his lead transport truck, hauling 40 tons of the crimson harvest, toward the Windermere Regional Grain Elevator. It was the only facility within a 200-mile radius capable of legally weighing, grading, and purchasing a crop of this magnitude. He pulled the massive rig onto the commercial weighing scales, honking the horn to signal the weighmaster. But the weighmaster didn't come out. Instead, the glass door of the facility office opened, and Harrison Goyle stepped out onto the loading dock. He was wearing an immaculate gray suit, looking entirely out of place amidst the grain dust and diesel fumes. He was flanked by Dean Harker, who sported a nasty purple bruise across his jaw, and 2 armed private security guards. Henry cut the truck's engine, a cold dread washing over him. He grabbed a crowbar from beneath his seat, just in case, and stepped out of the cab. "What are you doing here, Goyle?" Henry demanded, gripping the cold steel of the crowbar tightly. "I bought the facility, Henry," Goyle said smoothly, a venomous smile playing on his lips. Finalized the paperwork at 9 o'clock this morning. Apex AgriCorp is now the proud owner of the Windermere Regional Grain Elevator, which means we dictate what gets processed and what gets turned away. Goyle walked to the edge of the loading dock, looking down at Henry with undisguised contempt. "I heard about your little mutant harvest, quite the scientific anomaly. Unfortunately, Apex has a strict corporate policy against processing untested, unregulated, genetically modified contraband. We consider your red beans an environmental hazard. I have certified lab results from an independent geneticist proving zero toxicity and unprecedented nutritional value," Henry yelled, his blood boiling. "This crop is entirely legal to sell." "Not here, it isn't," Goyle countered, his voice dripping with malice. "And since every other elevator in the state is controlled by our subsidiaries, you have exactly nowhere to sell it. You have $4 million worth of rotting organic matter sitting in your trucks, Henry. And in 5 days, when you default on your loans, I will buy your farm at auction, burn those red beans in an incinerator, and bulldoze your grandfather's house into the dirt." Goyle turned his back. "Get this truck off my scales, Remington, before I have you arrested for trespassing." Henry drove back to the farm in a state of absolute hollow shock. He had won the battle against nature. He had beaten the impossible odds. He had grown a miracle, and he had still lost. Goyle had checkmated him using sheer, impenetrable corporate wealth. He parked the truck next to the silos, climbed out, and walked into the kitchen. Cleo was sitting at the table, surrounded by financial spreadsheets, a bright, hopeful smile on her face that shattered the moment she saw Henry's expression. "Artie, what happened? Did the elevator reject the grade?" Henry collapsed into a chair, the fight completely drained from his body. "Goyle bought the elevator. He's embargoed the crop. We have no buyer. We can't liquidate the beans. Cleo, we have the money to pay the bank. But it's locked in the silos, and no one in this state will process it. We're dead in the water." Cleo stared at him, the silence in the kitchen stretching out for a long, agonizing minute. The ticking of the grandfather clock sounded like a countdown to their doom. Then Cleo stood up. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. The fear that had plagued her for 3 years suddenly vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating corporate ruthlessness that Henry hadn't seen since she worked at the elite accounting firm in Chicago. She walked over to a dusty, forgotten box in the corner of the room, dug through it, and pulled out an old, leather-bound Rolodex. "Harrison Goyle thinks he's the only one who knows how to play corporate hardball," Cleo said, her voice dropping an octave, filled with icy resolve. She picked up her cell phone. He forgot who he was dealing with. Goyle controls the regional agricultural buyers, but he doesn't control the international biotech pharmaceutical sector. Henry looked up, a tiny spark of hope reigniting. "Cleo, who are you calling?" Cleo dialed a number, her eyes locking onto Henry's. "My old college roommate. She's the senior vice president of acquisitions at Vertex Bio in San Francisco. If Goyle won't buy our miracle crop for animal feed, we bypass agriculture completely. We sell it as medical-grade raw material." She put the phone to her ear. "And we are going to tear Harrison Goyle's empire to the ground." The transformation in Cleo Remington was immediate and terrifyingly efficient. For 3 years, Henry had known her as a supportive, anxious farm wife, trying to hold their crumbling world together with duct tape and prayers. He had completely forgotten that before she moved to Windermere Valley, Cleo was a ruthless corporate auditor who ate hostile takeovers for breakfast. The phone call to San Francisco lasted exactly 12 minutes. When Cleo hung up, the despair in the kitchen had been entirely neutralized, replaced by a crackling, electric tension. "Evelyn is flying out immediately," Cleo announced, opening her laptop and bringing up a flurry of legal documents. "She's the senior vice president of acquisitions at Vertex Bio. They specialize in high-yield, plant-based protein synthesis for experimental cellular therapeutics. If Caldwell's numbers are accurate, our red beans aren't cattle feed, Henry. They are the holy grail of biochemical engineering." Less than 24 hours later, a sleek, unmarked black helicopter touched down in the north pasture, sending the grazing cattle scattering in a panic. Out stepped Evelyn Hayes, a sharp-featured woman in a tailored navy pantsuit, flanked by 2 field technicians carrying silver Pelican cases. Evelyn didn't bother with pleasantries. She walked straight past Henry, gave Cleo a brief, fierce hug, and pointed to the massive silos. "Show me the anomaly, Cleo. If this is a waste of my time, I'm billing you for the jet fuel." Dr. Eris Caldwell was waiting at the silos. He handed Evelyn the spectrometer readouts. Her field technicians quickly drew core samples from the mountain of ruby red beans, running rapid microassays on the hood of Henry's truck. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. Henry stood by with his arms crossed, watching Evelyn's eyes scan the digital readout on her technician's screen. Evelyn slowly lowered her sunglasses, looking at the towering silos as if they were built of solid gold. "The protein density isn't 68%, Dr. Caldwell," she said, her voice eerily calm. "It's 71%. Furthermore, the zinc promethium catalyst has bonded with the amino acids in a way that creates a naturally occurring immunosuppressant precursor. Do you have any idea how much it costs us to synthesize this in a lab?" "I'm a dirt farmer, ma'am," Henry said flatly. "I just know they're illegal to process at the local elevator." Evelyn let out a sharp, genuine laugh. "Forget the local elevator, Henry. They couldn't afford a single ton of this. Vertex Bio will buy the entire yield. I am authorized to offer you $120 a bushel." Henry's knees genuinely threatened to buckle. He did the math in his head. The silos held roughly 50,000 bushels. $6 million, Cleo said, her voice deadpan, though her hands were shaking. $6 million, Evelyn confirmed. "But there is a catch. My legal department cannot execute a wire transfer of that magnitude for an unregistered bioasset while it sits on contested land. We need the physical product loaded onto a commercial freight train, out-of-state jurisdiction, crossing the Nevada line, before I can press send on the money. We can have it trucked to the rail yard in Miller's Creek by tomorrow night," Henry said, the adrenaline surging back into his veins. "Good, because if you don't secure the deed to this land by Friday, This crop technically becomes the property of whoever buys the farm at the foreclosure auction, Evelyn noted, glancing at her watch. I'll have the rail cars waiting. But Harrison Goyle had not built a billion-dollar empire by sitting idle. His spies in the valley had reported the helicopter landing, and Goyle knew instantly that Henry had found a back door. If he couldn't control the buyer, he would simply control the roads. The next morning, as Henry and Benji were hooking up the 3 massive 18-wheeler transport trucks, a fleet of Windermere County Sheriff's cruisers came tearing down the driveway, lights flashing and sirens wailing. Sheriff Miller, a man whose re-election campaigns were heavily funded by Apex AgriCorp, stepped out of his vehicle, holding a thick stack of legal paperwork. "Shut off the engines, Henry," Miller shouted over the roar of the diesels. "What is this, Miller?" Henry demanded, jumping down from the cab. "I have an emergency public health injunction," Sheriff Miller declared, slapping the papers onto the hood of Henry's truck. Anonymous tip reported the presence of highly unstable, toxic chemical mutations on this property. The EPA is being notified, but until they arrive next week, this entire farm is under strict quarantine. Nothing goes out. Not a person, not a truck, and certainly not whatever you have loaded in those trailers. Henry stared at the sheriff, a cold, suffocating fury gripping his chest. "Goyle put you up to this. There is no EPA investigation. We have lab reports proving the crop is safe. Take it up with the judge on Monday, Henry," Miller said with a smug, apologetic shrug that didn't reach his eyes. He signaled to his deputies. "Block the main gate, set up bike strips. Nobody leaves this property." It was Wednesday afternoon. The bank deadline was Friday at 5 p.m. The main road was completely blocked by heavily armed deputies. The trucks were trapped. The farmhouse felt like a war room. Henry paced the floorboards, running his hands through his hair in absolute frustration, while Cleo stared at the topographical map of Windermere Valley spread across the kitchen table. "We are totally boxed in," Henry muttered. "Even if we try to ram the gate, Miller will arrest me for assaulting an officer, impound the trucks, and Goyle wins anyway." Benji, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, nursing a cup of coffee, suddenly leaned forward, squinting his failing eyes at the topographical map. He tapped a gnarled finger on a dense, green patch bordering the eastern edge of the Remington property. "What about the Devil's Backbone?" Benji asked quietly. Henry stopped pacing. The Devil's Backbone was a treacherous, overgrown logging trail carved through the deep woods behind their property. It hadn't been used since the 1970s. It connected to a county back road that entirely bypassed Sheriff Miller's jurisdiction, leading straight to the Nevada state line. "Benji, that trail is completely reclaimed by the forest," Henry said, shaking his head. "It's choked with fallen oaks and mud. We're hauling 120 tons of freight. The trucks will get bogged down in the first mile." "Not if we grade it," Benji countered stubbornly. "Not if we clear it." "With what?" Cleo asked, tracing the route with her pen. "Henry and Benji can't clear a 3-mile logging road with chainsaws in one night." "We won't be alone," Henry said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. He looked at the clock. It was 6 p.m. Henry grabbed his phone and started making calls. He didn't call lawyers. He didn't call the press. He called the men who knew exactly what it felt like to have Harrison Goyle's boot on their necks. He called the independent farmers of Windermere Valley. By 11 p.m., a thick, rolling fog had settled over the valley, masking the eastern tree line. Sheriff Miller's deputies sat in their cruisers at the front gate, drinking coffee and listening to the radio, entirely oblivious to the mechanical army assembling 3 miles behind them. Deep in the woods at the edge of the Remington property line, the darkness was shattered by the roaring ignition of 20 massive, heavy-duty farm machines. Wyatt Ford, a burly farmer who had lost half his acreage to Apex AgriCorp 2 years prior, sat in the cab of a towering 12-ton bulldozer. Beside him was Samuel Cole in an industrial front-end loader, backed up by a dozen other locals, carrying heavy-duty chainsaws, logging cables, and floodlights. "All right, boys," Henry said over the CB radio, sitting in the lead 18-wheeler, the payload of red beans heavy at his back. "Miller is watching the front door. We're going out the back. We have 4 hours to cut a path through this forest before the sun comes up. Let's ride. The operation was a masterclass in agricultural brute force. Wyatt's bulldozer hit the tree line like a battering ram, snapping decades-old deadwood like twigs, grading the deep, treacherous mud into a semi-passable track. Men swarmed the downed trees, chainsaws screaming through the night air, hooking massive logs to chains and dragging them clear with tractors. Henry drove the lead rig inch by grueling inch, the heavy tires spinning and fighting for traction in the freshly turned earth. Benji and Cleo drove the second and third trucks, white-knuckling the steering wheels as the massive trailers swayed precariously on the uneven terrain. It was a grueling, agonizing crawl. But by 3 a.m., the convoy burst through the final thicket of pines and slammed their tires onto the hard, blessed asphalt of the county back road. They were out of Miller's jurisdiction. "We're clear," Henry shouted into the CB, exhausted but triumphant. "Thank you, Wyatt. Thank you, all of you." "Okay. Give Goyle hell for us, Henry." Wyatt's voice crackled back over the radio. The 3 trucks accelerated down the dark highway, the Nevada state line, and the Vertex Bio rail yard, only 20 miles away. But they weren't entirely alone. Dean Harker had been patrolling the perimeter of the farm in his black SUV, suspecting Henry might try something desperate. When he heard the distant roar of chainsaws, he had driven around the long way. Now, Harker's headlights appeared in Henry's rearview mirror, closing in fast. Harker swerved into the oncoming lane, pulling alongside Henry's massive rig. The window rolled down, and Harker brandished a heavy steel tire iron, gesturing aggressively for Henry to pull over. If Harker could shatter the truck's air brake lines, the entire convoy would be paralyzed on the shoulder until morning, giving Goyle time to get a federal judge to lock them down. Henry didn't flinch. He gripped the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Benji, Cleo, hold your lines. Do not stop." Harker gunned the SUV, swerving violently toward the truck's front tire, attempting to force Henry into the ditch. Suddenly, a blinding rack of LED floodlights erupted from the darkness just ahead. Waiting at the county intersection were Wyatt Ford and Samuel Cole, sitting in the cabs of 2 monstrous multi-ton combine harvesters. They had taken the shortcut out of the woods. As Harker's SUV tried to ram Henry, the 2 combines pulled directly into the center of the road, forming an impenetrable steel wall of agricultural machinery. Harker slammed on his brakes, the SUV's tires screaming against the asphalt in a cloud of white smoke. He skidded to a halt, mere inches from the massive, rotating steel teeth of Wyatt's combine header. Henry laid on the air horn, a deafening blast of triumph, as his 3 transport trucks blew past the terrified corporate thug, crossing the Nevada state line into the safety of the dawn. Friday, 4:45 p.m. The lobby of Windermere First National Bank was quiet, save for the ticking of the wall clock. Inside the glass-walled branch manager's office, Harrison Goyle sat comfortably in a leather chair, checking his designer watch. Thomas Mitchell sat rigidly behind his desk, looking physically ill. The foreclosure documents were laid out in front of him, requiring only the final signatures to transfer the deed of the Remington farm to Apex AgriCorp. "It's a shame, really," Goyle said smoothly, adjusting his cuffs. Henry had spirit, but spirit doesn't pay the mortgage. "If it makes you feel better, Thomas, I plan to name the new automated fertilizer depot after his grandfather. A nod to local history." Mitchell picked up his pen, his hand trembling slightly. "You're a vulture, Harrison." "I am an inevitability," Goyle corrected with a cold smile. "Sign the papers, Tom. The grace period is over." The heavy oak doors of the bank suddenly swung open with a resounding crash. Henry Remington strode into the lobby. He was covered in dried mud. His clothes smelled like diesel fuel and pine sap, and he had dark, exhausted bags under his eyes. But he walked with the posture of a king returning to his throne. Right behind him was Cleo, looking equally disheveled but possessing a terrifying, predatory smirk. Goyle stood up, his smile vanishing instantly. "What are you doing here, Henry? You're trespassing. The sheriff's quarantine doesn't apply in the state of Nevada," Henry interrupted, walking straight into the office and ignoring Goyle entirely. He planted his muddy boots firmly on the carpet. "Tom, I believe I have a remaining balance." Thomas Mitchell blinked, stunned. "Henry, the deadline is in 10 minutes. You need $250,000 in cleared funds." Cleo stepped forward and dropped a heavy, embossed leather folder onto the desk. Inside was a certified, heavily authenticated wire transfer receipt from Vertex Bio, legally stamped and verified by the Federal Reserve, routed directly into the Remington Farms primary account. Thomas stared at the document. He took off his glasses. He put them back on. He looked at the bottom line. $6 million. Thomas choked out, the color draining from his face before rushing back in a flush of sheer joy. "Pay off the primary mortgage," Cleo instructed, her voice crisp and commanding. "Pay off the equipment loans. Clear the private lender debt and put the remaining $5 million into a high-yield agricultural trust fund." Goyle's face turned an ugly mottled shade of purple. His pristine composure finally shattered. "This is a fraud. That crop was a biological hazard. I will have you investigated by the FDA, the EPA, and the FBI. I will tie you up in litigation for the next decade." Cleo slowly turned to face Goyle, stepping right into his personal space. "Actually, Harrison, you're the one who is going to be busy," Cleo said softly, her eyes glittering with corporate ruthlessness. "While Evelyn Hayes was securing our payment, her legal department did a little digging into Apex AgriCorp's recent acquisitions. It turns out, forcing local grain elevators into embargoes to manipulate land prices is a direct violation of federal antitrust laws." Vertex Bio's lawyers forwarded a rather comprehensive dossier to the Department of Justice this morning. Goyle took a step back, the blood completely draining from his face. "And," Henry added, stepping up beside his wife, "Dr. Caldwell found traces of Dean Harker's chemical defoliant on the pipes near my water supply. Turns out Harker isn't as good at wiping his fingerprints as he thinks he is. Sheriff Miller might be in your pocket, but the state police aren't." Henry leaned over the desk, picked up the foreclosure documents, and calmly ripped them in half, tossing the pieces onto Goyle's immaculate Italian leather shoes. "Get out of my town, Harrison," Henry said, his voice low and absolute. "And stay off my land." Goyle looked from Henry to Cleo to the beaming face of Thomas Mitchell. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the bank, the glass doors shuddering in his wake. The silence in the office was suddenly broken by Thomas Mitchell letting out a loud, booming laugh, leaning back in his chair and wiping a tear from his eye. "God almighty, Henry, you actually did it." Henry looked at Cleo. The exhaustion of the last month suddenly hit him. But it was a good exhaustion, the kind that comes after a long, honest day's work, when you know the harvest is secure. He pulled his wife into a tight embrace, burying his face in her shoulder. "We did it," he whispered. 6 months later, the Windermere Valley looked different. The Remington farm was no longer a struggling, dying plot of dust. It was a sprawling, state-of-the-art agricultural research facility. Henry had used the Vertex Bio funds to build deep-water irrigation wells, upgrade the equipment, and hire Benji as the full-time foreman with a massive pay raise and a brand-new truck. They didn't grow the mutant crimson beans again. The risk of the synthetic catalyst was too unpredictable, but they didn't need to. Cleo had established a regional cooperative using their newfound capital to offer zero-interest loans to the independent farmers in the valley, permanently breaking Apex AgriCorp's stranglehold on the community. Henry stood on the porch, holding a mug of coffee, watching the morning sun break over a field of perfectly healthy, vibrant green corn. He took a deep breath of the crisp air, feeling the solid, unforgiving, beautiful earth beneath his boots. He hadn't just saved his family's legacy, he had secured it for the next 100 years, proving that sometimes the greatest miracles don't come from a perfect plan. Sometimes they grow from the deepest dirt, born out of desperate hope, unwavering grit, and one spectacularly lucky mistake. And that is the incredible story of how Henry Remington turned a catastrophic mistake into a multi-million-dollar empire, taking down a corrupt corporate giant in the process. Sometimes, The absolute worst disasters in our lives are actually miracles in disguise. What would you have done if you walked out and saw that glowing red field? Let me know in the comments below. If you loved this epic underdog story of survival, grit, and family legacy, please smash that like button, share this video with your friends, and hit subscribe so you never miss another amazing tale.